Okay, sorry for the delay for those of you who may or may not have been watching the previous stream. Um, I had some stuff that I needed to deal with, but I'm doing something a little bit different now. Instead of just reading through directly, like I'm going to finish the recommendations, and then I'm going to jump straight over to part two because that's the bit that I think needs the most attention and that I need to be most familiar with before the town hall meeting. I am going to read the whole thing, but I'm probably not going to read the rest of it on stream, unfortunately. I'll just finish the recommendations and then jump straight to part two. Um, Probably won't get it all done today, but I should at least finish the recommendations today. So, let's go. Stewardship of the Unified Ecosystem. Recommendation 20. Create a new compact between Australian governments. 20.1 National Cabinet should agree a new disability intergovernmental agreement to underpin delivery of a comprehensive and unified disability support ecosystem. 20.2 National Cabinet should agree new funding arrangements to align incentives and share costs in the disability support ecosystem. 20.3 National Cabinet should establish a new permanent disability advisory council reflective of the diversity of people with lived experience of disability to advise disability reform ministers. I like that. 20.4 National Cabinet should develop a dedicated First Nations schedule under the new Disability Intergovernmental Agreement to embed a First Nations Disability Forum and an independent sector-specific accountability mechanism. Yep, that is important. And it's important that those are separate points. 20.5 National Cabinet should establish Disability Outcomes Council to monitor and publicly report, yes, on the performance of all governments in meetings, the outcomes, commitments, and benchmarks outlined in the Disability Intergovernmental Aid Agreement. All of that is good. Let's move on. 21. Clarify accountability, yes, for sustainability and governance of the disability ecosystem. 21.1 National Cabinet should be accountable for the sustainability of the unified disability ecosystem, including the NDIS. 21.2 The Department of Social Services, in consultation with state and territory governments, should review existing National Disability Insurance Agency operational guidelines to identify and prioritize opportunities to strengthen the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act 2013 and rules. Yes. 21.3 The Australian government should ensure that the minister responsible for the NDIS remains a cabinet minister. Ooh. I like that. 21.4 The Australian government should clarify roles of relevant agencies for administration, market stewardship, pricing policy, regulation, commissioning, and legislation. Okay. All of this, it's looking like it's about the government's, the wider government's role and their responsibilities. I'm liking this so far, very much so. It's very much that upper level of not even the upper level. It's the politician side of thing. 22 Embed a highly skilled person-centered disability-aware culture across all disability agencies and government. 22.1 When undertaking capability reviews, the Australian Public Service Commission should have regard to the capacity, capability, and culture of the NDIA, National Disability Supports Quality and Safeguards Commission, and Department of Social Services to deliver relevant reforms. The NDI 22.2 The NDIA and the new National Disability Supports Quality and Safeguards Commission should publish biennial culture and capability plans supported by independent audits and staff participant and stakeholder surveys. Yes. This is absolutely a yes. It's always the question, though, of how much work are you asking disabled people to do at a fundamental level. Disabled people absolutely need to be invited in, which is what this is. It's the question of how much work are we being asked to do and how much work should we be doing. And that is as much, it's disabled people should be doing as much as possible, but also we shouldn't be obliged to do things. If we can't do things, that doesn't mean things shouldn't happen. It's a trade-off, unfortunately, in terms of getting things done. 22.3. The Australian government should redesign the participant service guarantee to prioritise high quality, transparent, and efficient decisions and improve participant experience. So I just want to go back to what I just said there when I said it was a trade off, because I don't want that to come across as in any way negative or ableist. But to use my own experience, but there are a lot of other disabled people in a similar boat. If I have an episode and I physically and mentally cannot do a thing, that doesn't mean I do not want that thing to happen, and I may need other people to take over to have it happen in my absence. In other words, in order for things to happen, I, as a disabled person, may have to rely on able people to do things on my behalf. And not everything can be done that way. And I am aware of that. And sometimes, if I can't do things, that means things simply do not and will not happen. And often that is tragic, especially when that is anything social. I want to run a games night. I'm not conscious. The games night doesn't happen. And that happens often enough, and it never happens. So, there's a certain amount where we need able-bodied people to be doing these jobs. But also, where we can, whoever wants to should be trying to do as much as possible. But it's hard to rely on anybody whose disability is unreliable, but that doesn't apply to all disabilities. So that's kind of what I'm kind of bouncing around here, is that the trade-off doesn't apply to everyone who's disabled, and it obviously isn't the default that we should work with. But it's still a question that should be asked, because depending on what questions you're asking and who you're asking them to and who they're for, you can end up with situations, and this has very much happened historically, where physically disabled people get prioritized because they are simply more able to take on the mental load of doing this sort of thing. Whereas people who are mentally disabled are not able to take on the mental load of doing these things. So, as a consequence, if somebody isn't fighting on their behalf, they don't get attention, and they don't receive the supports that they need. But if you try and put the load on the mentally disabled people, you still might not get the outcome, because they are not mentally able to deal with the load. Again, this does not apply to all disabled people, but that is what I was referring to with there is a trade-off. And it is sometimes unavoidable, and you need to work with the best situation that you can. And that's all I'm wondering here, is how much is the trade-off going to be present? Is it going to be present at all? Or is it going to result in certain groups not receiving the appropriate attention because they aren't able to contribute their part enough? It's hard to say that, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say there without it being problematic outside of context, because it's all about what context it is, and it depends on the context. So sometimes everything I just said won't apply at all, other times it'll apply way too much. Anyway, 22.4, the Disability Reform Ministerial Council should agree measurable culture and capability outcomes as part of new funding arrangements. I think what this is trying to actually say is that, hey, we need to embed disability culture, or at least increase awareness of disability culture all over the place. It's about a little bit more educational, at least in the political sphere. I'm not really seeing anything down from the political sphere, like not really seeing anything about, hey, we should build awareness in communities, like we should put paid adverts to show the disabled experience. We should encourage groups to incorporate disabled people in various ways. We should increase some part of the educational budget so that disabled people are treated better, both from an educational sense but also in a student sense, from a bullying standpoint, which is an entirely different conversation. But when I started reading recommendation 22, I thought maybe stuff like that might be in here, which I think it's fine that it isn't in here, because that's not the point of this section, but I feel like there should be a section that actually approaches that. Anyway, let's move on. 23. Measure what matters, build an evidence base of what works, and create a learning system. Are you telling me they weren't already doing this? 23.1. National Cabinet should agree to replace the current NDIS outcomes framework with a new disability support outcomes framework. Alright, so they were doing it to some extent, but apparently it needs replacing. 23.2. The Department of Social Services, in consultation with the National Disability Insurance Agency, the new National Disability Supports Quality, blah, 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 and the Independent Health Aged Care Pricing Authority, should establish and manage an NDIS evidence committee to provide guidance on reasonable and necessary disability supports. I do like the sound of that, and I like that these three different groups are being involved in that, but that's assuming that those three different groups actually remain three different groups. Because here's the thing. The Independent Health and Aged Care Pricing Authority, great, but I'm guessing these two lean on each other. So if you've got these three, and it's like, okay, we're voting on a new thing, and it's the best out of three, I feel like these two are going to win all the time. Which, obviously that's not necessarily how it's going to be set up, but I feel like if you want to set something like this up, you want more independence in there, so that the proverbial vote or discussion can actually be more diverse, more inclusive, and you don't end up with monopoly decision making. Might not be that way, but that is the concern I have from yay, there's three of them. What are the biases of those three? 23.3. The Department of Social Services should establish a new disability research and evaluation fund to coordinate and fund research and independent evaluation activities. 23.4. All Australian governments should agree to jointly invest in actions to improve disability data quality and sharing. 23.5. The Australian government should ensure that all disability reporting mechanisms facilitate the collection, analysis, and publication of intersectional indicators. That all sounds pretty good. Yeah, that seems to be, hey, let's build data and be transparent about it and actually make decisions based on the data, which is what they were supposed to be doing already. So this might not be so much they weren't doing this, although I often feel that they weren't doing this, but let's pretend for the moment that they actually were doing this to some extent. They would still need to make something like this, simply because they're creating the new department and they need to put forward how that department, what its relationships are going to be, and they're, incorporating the independent health and age. Like, something like this would need to happen even if the current system was working perfectly fine. Now, the current system isn't working perfectly fine. It's hard to see what, evidence-based decisions they're actually making. Or rather, sorry, that's incorrect. They are making evidence-based decisions, but the people making the decisions aren't qualified in the medical fields or the various experiential fields in order to be qualified to make those decisions. So it's not that the evidence isn't there, it's that the people making the decisions don't necessarily have a holistic understanding of what the evidence even means. And none of that is necessarily being addressed here, because that is a staffing issue more than anything else. Now, obviously, there might be, within the context of the reviews, staffing policies do change, but I haven't actually seen anything about that, really. Like, there's nothing in these recommendations so far saying that people on the board need to have medical qualification. People on the board need to have medical or disability qualifications. People on the board need to have a background in budgeting and economics and so on and so forth. People on the board, blah, blah, blah. Like, this should be a pretty qualified job, and I'm not seeing anything on it. And it's a job that is currently, if I recall correctly, and I'm pretty sure I do because I was... Anyway, as far as I'm aware, the people on the board are appointed into the position, which makes it from the top down. Which, I mean, that sounds like all jobs, right? You know, so your boss puts you in that position, but it's not like you don't have to be qualified to enter into that position. There's no criteria that says somebody on the board must have X, Y, Z qualifications. In the same way, this is a bit of a different conversation now, but in the same way that the Minister for Disability doesn't necessarily have to have a background in disability. They don't necessarily have qualifications in anything to do with the ministerial position, which I personally think is a problem with our governmental system, is that ministers should have a background, but they don't have to. You can have people with no qualifications taking on a ministerial or cabinet position. So, you know, coming back over here, I like the fact that, was it over here? Well, wherever it was. I like the fact that, you know, hey, we want to make this a cabinet position forever going forwards, but if that cabinet position is being filled by someone who isn't qualified and or doesn't have any experience, which I would argue experience is a qualification, then that could be a problem. It could even be more problematic because you're now putting somebody in a position of power who has not even necessarily bad ideas, but could have harmful ideas and could not understand the ideas that are being put forward to them. That sort of thing can and does historically happen with ministerial positions. So, yeah, in principle it's a good thing, but if you're not putting down qualifications for the staffing, that it could result in not great outcomes. Anyway, recommendation 24, 5-year transition. Let's just clear this thing in one stream, shall we? Recommendation 24, establish appropriate architecture to implement reforms. 24.1, the Disability Reform Ministerial Council should agree architecture to support implementation and delivery of the NDIS reform agenda. Good. 24.2, the new NDIS Review Implementation Advisory Committee should report to the Disability Reform Ministerial Council every 6 months or so as needed. Action 24.3, the new NDIS Experience Design Office should commission agile projects to design and test reforms to the participant pathway. Okay, I'm not sure what they mean by agile projects, and the reason I say I don't know what they mean is because agile is a system of organization. If you're familiar with like workplace organizations, you know, you've got the agile method, the waterfall method, and a few other different methods, which that's where my brain jumped to immediately. But if that's not what it means, I'm actually not sure what that means in this, like, should commission agile projects. What does that sentence actually mean? I actually don't know. And I feel like it's probably, like somebody else, it's probably really obvious, and that's a semantic point that doesn't confuse them at all. But it is confusing me right now. I'm like, what is that? Because I feel like yeah. 25. Coordinate and consult on amendments to relevant legislation to enact proposed reforms. 25.1, the Department of Social Services, with input from the National Disability Insurance Agency and NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, should review the recommendations from this review and develop a proposed package of legislative reforms. Yeah, I guess, absolutely. 26. Develop an implementation roadmap that factors in critical dependencies and risks and ensures a smooth transition for existing participants. 26.1, National Cabinet should agree and publish an implementation roadmap. Yeah. 26.2, the National Disability Insurance Agency should ensure existing participants experience a smooth and fair transition to the new participant pathway. Yeah, and 26.3, the new NDIS Review Implementation Working Group should coordinate communications across relevant agencies to regularly update and inform stakeholders on implementation progress. Okay. Look, all of that sounds good, but one thing I'm confused at, a 5-year transition. This heading is promising a 5-year transition, but I don't see anything in the rest of here that actually relates to that, right? Like, you could have removed the term 5 year. Um, you could have just made that the transition, and it would change nothing. Is a 5 year transition a promise or a commitment? Or is it just a statement? Like, is it just a implication, which, they can fall back on or ignore as they wish? Um, I don't know. Like, just the fact that I didn't see any, like, the only other thing in here was, like every 6 months or so, or as appropriate. Um, yeah. Look, it's not a big deal because, it's just, this is the name of the subsection, but I don't see any part of the recommendation that accords to that. So, hmm. Anyway, I'm going to stop this recording, but I'll keep streaming and we'll move on to the next one.